Hello, and welcome to episode 30 of the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. I'm so glad that you're joining us today. Today, we are going to be looking at Exodus chapters 35, 36, and 37, Psalm chapter 29, and Mark chapter 1. We're beginning our journey through the Gospel of Mark. We just finished Matthew, and now we're moving into Mark. The second gospel at least in the canon, it's actually, we believe, probably the first gospel that was actually written. So we're going to be talking a lot about that. Mark chapter 1, it's going to be a great journey, and I'm glad that you've joined us. And so I'm going to ask also now Craig and Amber to join us. Craig and Amber, thanks for joining in.
Hello, everybody.
Thanks for all the studying you did this week to help us kind of work our way through this. We're coming to the end of Exodus, right? We've just, I think, maybe have one more week after this one left in Exodus. So that's been really pretty awesome. I've actually enjoyed Exodus a lot more than I thought I was going to. There's a lot more narrative in Exodus than I think people think. And so it's actually been rather enjoyable. But we're going to be finishing up Exodus soon and then moving into the rest of our readings. So thanks for being here. Let's go ahead and begin today by talking about the chapters in Exodus. So Craig, why don't you start for us and talk to us a little bit about what you got out of these chapters in Exodus?
Yeah, sure. So nearly all of Exodus 35 through 40, the first part of this section that we're in this 35, 36, and 37, but it's part of this bigger section of the last five chapters, 35 through 40. But the whole section is simply a repeat of Exodus 25 through 31, and it's more in the past tense. So you come in, I'm starting to read chapter 35 on this past Monday or Tuesday as I made my way through the journey of the week, and it's like, this is familiar.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking back at the earlier chapters of Exodus and realizing this is pretty much a repeat. And so you're kind of scratching your head, and we talked last week or a week before last about how expensive books were to write back then. And you're wondering, why would the Holy Spirit inspire Moses, and Moses go through trouble writing all of this again when he just written it? And a couple things, I think, theologically and just kind of for our souls as humans come out, at least the way I thought about it. One was after the, I call it Golden Calf Gate, kind of a Watergate reference, but after the Golden Calf incident and all of the disobedience and idolatry of Israel, we see them actually being obedient here. We see them following through and building to the specifications the tabernacle that God provided Moses in those earlier chapters on the mountain. So it's nice to see Israel actually following through the commands of God for a change, as opposed to acting like spoiled children like we most usually act, even us. And secondly, we see what does God think about this? We won't see this week, but next week at the end of chapter 40, we'll see that God actually comes and rests in the tabernacle, and his presence is going to live and tabernacle with his people. And so we finally have this sense of resolution where the wandering and the angst and the kind of straying away in idolatry, it all comes home and God forgives and his people are obedient. And we have the sense of community finally being formed with the people themselves and between God and the people. And the loving kindness and merciful God, along with justice that we saw in the description last week, and the description of God of himself as he passed across Moses, I think in chapter 34. But we see that lived out and finally embodied here.
Yeah, it's good. It's like the first time we went through this detailed account of it, it was like he was commanding them to do this. And now in this one, it's like they're actually doing it. It has this feeling of urgency, like it's happening, and he repeats it. I think it's interesting that the whole thing is prefaced by the Sabbath. Like he keeps reminding them of the Sabbath. Amber, did you get that from that as well?
Yeah, exactly right. I actually had that exact same note. The very first thing I noticed is all of a sudden you are realizing that this is a busy people. They have a lot to do. They have contributions they have to come up with. They have to get all the materials. You have all the workmanship. I mean, if you read this, you can just tell they're busy. But yet, right before the busyness, it starts with the Sabbath all over again. And it's very direct. It's like, and whoever doesn't do this will go to death. Like, it's like very stern. God is here. But I just wrote down the note that it's clear to me that obedience is the prerequisite for doing God's work. So to really do God's work well, they had to rest in God so they can do God's work.
Yeah, that's great. It's like you. This is so important, guys. The idea of Sabbath, as God say, if you're going to accomplish all this, you have to get this Sabbath part right. It's like God has to force us to slow down and stop, right? And to do that regularly, to have this work-life balance, that's super important. I think more and more people are seeing that. In some ways, the pandemic brought this out, how important rest is. Feels like to me with the pandemic, we all had to just kind of stop. We were forced to actually literally live at home and kind of be confined to that.
Mm.
And it was then when we realized, oh wow, I was so busy, I was so overwhelmed, and this is great to be able to take this rest. So
Yeah,
that's super important.
it's like when you have those business experts and you're reading books about like, oh, this is why it's so important to have rest, and you're like, oh, it's not a new concept.
Yeah, no,
No.
that's right. Yeah, it's right there in the Bible. It's been there for 3,000 years here, guys.
Mhm.
But it really
I
is. It is that like the story of Luther. It's attributed to Luther, who would say he started every day with 2 hours of prayer, and then they would say, and if it was going to be a really busy day, he would spend 4 hours in prayer. You would
right, I
expect if
love
it's
it.
busy to do less, but he would spend even more because I'm going to need it even more. So I think that's super important to see there. And then in this passage also, how specific they get again. Once again,
Yes.
God gets very specific. It's like he's painting this picture for them, this vision, and how they for the first time, I think, in the story since they've left Egypt, it seems like they get unified and excited about this vision. Did you guys catch that as well?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it comes across in the details of the materials they use, of the dimensions that they're
Hmm.
told to cut and build of the specific material, and the counts, the 50 beads, the poles, etc., made
Hmm.
out of acacia wood. And so you're right. It seems very detailed for a vision, but this is the first time they've ever seen anything like this, and it's replacing Egypt in their heart with what God has given Moses, and Moses has relayed that somehow. And how is Moses going to relay the specificity that God provided him, other than through the specificity that He provided? And
Hmm.
so,
Yeah.
I think the unity goes also additionally to that. I think the unity comes into them having to contribute, like me having to be a part. Like you see it over and over again. You have hearts stirred, spirits moved, hearts stirred again. You have the free will offering. You have all whose hearts was stirred up to come do the work. You have these language over and over again that was not in the first part, and it's this, like you said, is this unifying, like, oh, we have to be a part of this, and that makes you believe in it more, like you're going, what we're doing next.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A vision gives people that excitement and that direction of we're all doing this together. What you said exactly, Amber, about their giving. This is another part. The first part was Sabbath. The second part that he really emphasizes hard is the giving, not just financially, but of their gifts, of their talents. They had given them all these abilities as craftsmen. They had learned all this in Egypt, right? They'd learned how to do the craftsmanship in Egypt, but they bring that with them, and God takes it all. He says, we need all of that. And then the way the people respond with the giving, right? They just keep giving and giving and giving, so much to the point where they actually at one point say, right, okay, stop giving, right? How
That's
many
right.
churches ever do that where they say, we have too much, we have plenty to do everything we need to do, y'all stop giving? I don't think
Yeah.
that's ever happened at First Baptist Church, Richardson, and most churches. But
The
that's
and
just so
language,
cool.
that is, the language says, so the people were restrained from bringing, like literally like restrained, like, no, we want to give, and you're like, no, you can't, we
Yeah.
have enough. I
we
noticed this overabundance, this kind of this overabundance that you get with God when you give to God, and he's going to have this overabundance, he's going to use it for good. And also, I wrote this side note, I know that we assume that everyone give because everyone's hearts were stirred. It doesn't say that, it says all who were stirred. I wrote down that, man, what a bummer it would be if you had a stirred heart and yet you hesitated to give. And now you are not able to contribute to the very place that God's going to dwell. So when you come to sacrifice, when you come to worship, you're going to be reminded, I was stirred and I did not give. Guys, if God stirs you to do something, don't hesitate. You're going to, don't
Right.
miss your
You,
chance.
you might miss out. Right.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I think we see this overabundance even in our own society. We're a very materially wealthy society. There's not generally a want of food, of
Mhm.
even money.
Mhm.
There's problems with distributing it out to where it's always needed.
Sure.
But there's concentrations of wealth. But the churches and the people of God are becoming more and more starved in these days as society changes and the wealth, the concentrations of wealth transfer from one generation to the next or one population group to the next. So even though, even when there's an overabundance in society, that if people aren't following what God calls them to do, to your point, then, God's going to find a way, but the people in the world may suffer as a result.
Yeah, it's not automatic. The people had to respond. God said, put out the vision. He put out the word, and people responded, and they responded with joy. They gave willingly. The other thing it says is that it was like voluntarily. It was willingly. They weren't arm twisting. They weren't coercing. It's something you had to feel that you're supposed to give, and so many of them did. They responded to the moving of the Spirit.
Yeah, it wasn't like Moses had some really the new creative way of fundraising. Yeah, it wasn't that at all.
No, that's right. You just put it out there, and people just gave because they believed in the vision. This is also the first thing, really. The first effort that they have is it's building this tabernacle. It's a mobile tabernacle, right? And I don't want y'all to, guys, if you're out there watching, to get the wrong impression. This is not the temple at Jerusalem. This is not the temple that was made of stone and all that. This is a very much a mobile temple in the desert, in the wilderness, made of cloth, a tent-like structure.
I call it a tent on the go.
A tent on the go. They can take it down. They can put it up. The cloud is over it, right? The cloud by day, the fire by night. They know when the cloud or fire is not there, it's time to pack up and move to another location to follow God. This idea we're following God wherever he's leading us. That's all part of this scene. But this is the first non-Egyptian kind of thing they do. This is not Egyptian. This is their own, right? They're not. You remember you mentioned it earlier, Craig, with the golden calf that they tried to build because Moses was gone. Moses was gone. They thought we haven't seen him. He for all we know, he's dead. What are we going to do? Well, what they did was what they knew to do was back to the Egyptian ways with the golden calf, and because they didn't have a vision, they didn't have the vision yet. Moses from the mountaintop brings down the vision, and this is the vision. And the vision they get probably the most excited about is this tabernacle, obviously, because that really brings them around. And this tabernacle has nothing to do with Egypt. This is actually this is their Hebrew, to put it, their golden calf this is the thing that God is calling them to do, to pull them away from Egypt. We talked about the God getting them out of Egypt through the 10 plagues, but then in this wilderness, he's trying to get Egypt out of them. And this is the first step in that is having their own worship and the worship of Yahweh, not the worship of any other idols.
It's interesting they have to get there through hard work, sweat, blood, and toil, and we talk raising boys especially. You get the sense that they have to become men by going through hard work or through build character by going through trials, and it's kind of that sense that I get here anyway. They have to kind of wring that Egypt out of them and build character that God wants them to have by going through hard work in the desert.
Yeah.
I'm reminded as I was reading this and also last week in the golden calf story, where's all this gold coming from anyways? They have all this jewelry and all this stuff. Like, weren't they an oppressed people for 400 years and they kind of left with the sandals on their feet and unleavened bread? I mean, they didn't have much. So where did all this come from? They're in the desert. It isn't like they're making money. They're not. So I kind of went backwards to try to figure this out. So if you don't mind, I want to take a quick little trip backwards to figure where we get this gold from.
Yeah.
You will, if you go back to the plague story in chapter 11 and 12, you see this twice. One, God telling Moses, and then one telling Moses telling the people what God told him to tell him. And you'll notice that it says, now go to your neighbors, go to the Egyptians and ask them for their silver and gold. I'm in chapter 12, verse 35. Ask the Egyptians for their gold and their silver jewelry and for clothing, and the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they will give them everything they asked. So here you have a God who actually told his people to plunder the Egyptians on their way out. They asked for it and the Egyptians were happy to give it, not some people are like, oh, because they're like, please get out of here.
Yeah.
You've done, I think part of it, God just stirred them, just like they just stirred them here. They stirred them to give. They said God gave them favor. The people gave it willingly. And so
Mhm.
they plundered the Egyptians on the way out. And so why that? Why would God do that? He's already done enough damage. So I went backwards some more. If you go back to Genesis in chapter 15, this is this is God giving Abraham the promise.
Mhm.
The promise. And so I'm actually going to go it instead of trying to just do it out of memory. But in chapter 15, here we go. This is what God says to Abram before he becomes Abraham. It says
Mhm.
Abram. And the Lord said to Abram, now for certain that your offspring will be sojourn in a land that is not theirs, and they will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. So where are we talking about? We're
Mhm.
talking about Egypt
Yeah.
here.
Mhm.
Mhm. But I will bring judgment on the nation that you serve, and after they shall come out with great possessions.
Mm. Yeah.
God told Abram from the beginning that not only were they going to be somewhere and they're going to be slaves under oppression for 400 years in a land that's not theirs, but eventually he will judge that land, judge that nation, bring you out and with possessions. That's exactly why God had them plunder the Egyptians. He was fulfilling his own promise.
Yeah, and the very gold and silver, there was Egyptian gold and Egyptian silver that had
Yes. So
formerly been used probably to their deities. Now God
yes.
is turning around and using it to build the temple. I did a little bit of math, and just in the words describing the things that they would use on the table, the utensils and stuff, the amount of gold, all of that was made of pure gold. Many things were gold plated, but the actual utensils that they use and stuff, the bowls and stuff for the was made of pure gold. And the amount of gold, I think it was like 34 pounds, something like that. But it came to today's price, $1.8 million
Wow.
just for that part of it, just for the utensils and things they were using on the table. $1.8 million worth of gold in today's numbers just for that. It's crazy. When you talk about abundance and overabundance, the way God blesses you when you're faithful to Him, when you're obedient, He brings everything you need. He is the God who provides. He can provide for whatever your biggest dreams are for Him, if you're doing it for Him. Now the motive has to be right. It's not for yourself, it's for Him.
Sure.
And so that was just an amazing moment. Yeah. So they're building the temple. They're going to build, he describes the ark, right? The ark of the covenant. This is the first time where that's described. And that's going to be a part of the worship, big part of the worship experience. Did you guys pull anything out of that part of it?
I did. I have something really interesting that stood out to me,
Hmm.
and it's as it jumped off the page at me. And then I wondered if it was written this way when God described it to Moses. I went backwards and looked, and sure enough, it was written the same way. I just missed it the first time, or maybe God really just wanted to pull it out this time.
Hmm.
But it's talking specifically of how they were designing the Ark of the Covenant, specifically the mercy seat, and it's talking about he made them of hammered work on two ends of the mercy seat. He's talking about the cherubim. It says two cherubim made of gold, hammered work on the two ends of the mercy seat. One cherubim on one end and one cherubim on the other.
Mm.
And as that popped out to me, I was thinking, wait a second, why would you have to double describe it? When you said that there was two cherubim on both ends with the mercy seat in the middle, I already got the picture. So
Right.
why do you have to add more language to say one on one end and one on the other with that specific wording? And I was like, I'm going to go commentary and see if I can find something. Well, I didn't find anything, but I prayed and meditated on God's word. And here's what came out for me. And I'm really excited about this, is it reminded me instantly before I looked up one commentary, hoping that they would confirm my thoughts. I immediately thought of the same language as they're coming across the Red Sea, as the wall on one end, on one side, and the wall of water on the other side, and they're in the middle. And in the middle was what? It was the first time for the word salvation to be used, for God's people to be saved. And it's down the center. Right here, you have a cherubim on one end, you have a cherubim on the other, and in the center is the very for salvation, which is the mercy seat. And I just thought that was a beautiful picture. It stood out to me so deeply. And then also, I mentioned several weeks ago when I first brought this up, is that Christ ultimately, when you have nowhere to go, when you cannot go left and you cannot go right, life this way is hard and you're suffering, you don't know where to go. This side, you just have nowhere to go. But the only way to go is a narrow path, and that narrow path is Jesus, and that is so it all points to the center. That's what I'm trying to say. I think it's written that way intentionally to bring this image at the center is where the salvation is.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's beautiful. It's beautiful imagery. The Bible uses that imagery, and you do see it repeating itself and going through with especially the parting of the Red Sea. I love that, Amber. That's beautiful. It's a beautiful image of the waters protecting them on either side, and the mercy seat, and also the what's the word for it? Really, the sacred danger, if you will, of that, because remember, anyone who touched the ark would die, and there's the one scene where the poor guy does try to hold it up and touch it, and he ends up dying. That there's also this danger. So the water it protected and saved Israel, but it also destroyed that which was evil, right? It destroyed it. And so you see the ark doing the same thing. So that's great. That's a beautiful imagery. I love that.
The cherubim are supposed to, every time you see cherubim, are supposed to think boundary, the boundary between God and his people because of our sin. So the cherubim are like the bouncers of the God. So like for the Egyptians, it'd be the Sphinx outside of the tombs. That was their kind of bodyguard bouncer. That's what the cherubim kind of is. And that's why the cherubim shows up as they leave the garden. It is before the fall, there was no boundary between God and his people. When the fall happened and they got pushed to the east outside of the garden, a cherubim was placed there. That is the boundary between God and his people. Did I say the garden? What did I say?
No, I'm saying to guard it. You're right.
Yeah, to guard it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's right. Beautiful. Awesome. Okay, well, we're kind of trying to move from Exodus to Mark, but anything else you have from Exodus, or even maybe the Psalm that Psalm 29 is something that we read this week too. There's some connection there.
Yeah, real quick. We just coming off of reading the completion of the tabernacle in these chapters in Exodus. When I hopped into Psalm 29, it just struck me that here is a celebration of the completion of the tabernacle, where God as King is coming to dwell and with his people and sit upon his throne, his earthly throne. And that's not the imagery that the psalmist was going for when he wrote the psalm, but coming off of just reading Exodus and considering the tabernacle and it's being built, and God, and anticipating next week in chapter 40, God coming to rest on it in Exodus 40. Just seeing this it just moved me a lot to have this expressed as a celebration of what we just saw accomplished and the result of the people's hard work.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's great that we're reading Psalm 29 at the same time we're reading about the tabernacle, because it really does fit in really nicely. And how much the tabernacle came to mean to them. And remember too, guys, this was a mobile tabernacle. I don't want you to confuse it where, you had Solomon's temple. This is hundreds and hundreds of years later. Solomon will build his temple, the structure that's in Jerusalem. And then, of course, Nehemiah and Ezra will come back and build the second one. And then actually Herod will build the third one that was around when Jesus was around. Those were permanent structures in Jerusalem. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a mobile tent-like structure that it was on the move. It was on the go. The cloud would be on it during the day, the fire at night, and they would move as they needed to. So it's really an amazing thing, an amazing accomplishment for them. This is the first big kind of unified accomplishment that they have, and they're so excited about it. So it's a really great moment for history. Excellent. Well, let's move to Mark chapter 1, because there's plenty there as well to cover, right? Just really quickly, just a framework to set up Mark. We're entering into the Gospel of Mark. Most scholars believe that Mark was actually the first gospel to be written, probably written somewhere in the 50s, maybe the early 60s AD by one of Jesus's disciples, not necessarily named in the Gospels, but Mark. And so believe that Mark was the author and that Peter was his main source for information. And it's the shortest gospel. It moves very quickly. The word immediately is peppered throughout the entire gospel. It's one of his favorite words, because immediately Jesus moves here, and then immediately he does this, and then immediately, and it moves quickly. I tell new Christians when they're wanting to read the Bible, they've never read the Bible, they want to start reading the Bible, I tell them, start with the Gospel of Mark, because it moves so quickly. It tells you everything you need. It has the whole story in there, but it moves fast. Mark reads like a screenplay, and a really good screenplay, right? A lot of action, a lot of stuff going on. So as we move into this first chapter, he's setting it up, and he kind of starts it with John the Baptist. The thing that Mark is doing here in the first chapter, and really the first 3 or 4 chapters, Mark is working very hard to set up the authority of Jesus. That's the question that keeps coming up in the gospel, in this first part of the gospel. He's setting up where Jesus gets his authority from. It's a question that keeps recurring. The Pharisees and others are asking, where do you get your authority from? Where does your authority come from? And it's answered again and again. In the Gospel of Mark, it's answered by witnesses. He has these witnesses who are testifying to who he is. John the Baptist at the beginning, the voice of God, you at the baptism, you are my son. Even the demons are testifying to who he is. We know who you are, O Son of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have this really building up where he's setting up the authority of Jesus. And he begins right from the very beginning with the first chapter. And I'm telling you guys, right, it takes up and it moves fast. There's a lot in this first chapter. So where do you guys want to kind of go with what's happening in chapter 1? Or is there anything you wanted to add or onto what I just said as far as setting everything up?
Yeah, Alice, you're right. I remember when we first started Matthew, we did an entire podcast just at the beginning of Matthew, entire podcast just on the baptism, just entire podcast just on the temptation of Jesus. And now we have it all right here together. It was like, whoa, how are we going to do any of that? Luckily, it's sort of a repeat, so we can maybe catch something that Mark did differently.
Yes.
But one of the interesting things about Mark is that, there are always skeptics out there about all these things. And so one of the things I noticed, so I read about the skeptics, how do you know that Mark wrote it? And how do you know that Peter was his eyewitness? Well, there's some ancient ways that they did that, not just in scripture, but other ancient texts. And one of the things we've talked about this word inclusio a couple times. Inclusio is where you have something at the beginning and at the end of a chapter or a paragraph that it kind of bookends it. And you're supposed to say, oh, pay attention. This is the important, and everything in the middle supports it. And so I note Mark, this also happens with different ways of saying, hey, this is my eyewitness person who I'm getting this information from without interrupting the narrative, without having to say it in the narrative. And Mark does this really interestingly in Mark chapter 1, back down in verse 16. This is where he's calling his disciples. He saw Simon, which is Peter. He saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon. Well, you wouldn't have to say it like that normally. Normally you would just say Simon and his brother Andrew. But
Right.
Mark writes it that way intentionally. He writes it, it says Simon, and then it says Simon. So basically it's saying Peter, twice in a row, and it doesn't need to, but it does. And you go back all the way to the very end, the last chapter of Mark 16, it does something very similar. It says, this is when Jesus is resurrected. You have the women, he's introduced, he said to the women, and the women, he says, go tell all the disciples and Peter. Well, Peter's one of the 12 disciples. So right there, you have it say Peter again. Well, it doesn't have to. That's intentional on Mark's part. Mark is saying he is my eyewitness. This is his inclusio.
Yeah.
Peter is my eyewitness. I'm getting most of my accounts from him without interrupting the narrative. This is a really interesting way that ancient people wrote text.
Absolutely.
That's fascinating.
That's very good. The authors would also, it was considered bad idea or bad etiquette to actually take credit for to put yourself in there or to have a byline and that kind of thing. So most writings of antiquity didn't tell you who was writing it actually, but they would put themselves in there in little ways. And so there is also that scene where at the end you wonder why it said this, where there's the disciples are running at Gethsemane, they're running away, and one young man's running, and the guard grabs his cloak and he runs off naked, right? It's kind of a funny kind of scene. You wonder, why did it include that? Well, many scholars speculate, well, that's Mark putting himself into the story. That was Mark, the young man who ran off naked. He's kind of self-deprecating, putting himself in there. But yeah, that's really great. That's an important piece.
Sorry, it's almost like Stan Lee putting himself into his MCU movies.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Or Alfred Hitchcock puts himself into a little part in every movie. Yeah. So here we have him establishing the authority of Jesus through the testimony of John the Baptist, and then there's the baptism. So what did you guys get in this one? Maybe that's from that baptism scene. Is there anything that popped out at you?
Real quick, I wanted to kind of go back to the overview and before we get into the baptism.
Sure, good. Go ahead.
So just kind of contrasting Mark's view of Jesus and him setting up Jesus's authority through witnesses. We just got done with Matthew, where we saw everybody ask where he got his authority, and he would give a parable or he would ask a question. So you saw his authority established through teaching. Nobody teaches like this. He teaches one with authority.
Yeah.
That was in Matthew. So we get into this view of Mark, and it's a little bit different in unique ways. And I pulled out a book I read a long time ago that talked about the differences between the four different gospels. It's written by Richard Burridge. It's called Four Gospels, One Jesus. But Richard Burridge's view of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark is that he's a lion. And he doesn't just make this up. This is taken from the church fathers and some theologians who have analyzed this. Mm-hmm. But just the Jesus bounding from one scene to the next, him, to your point, Ellis, the many uses of immediately that strings a bunch of scenes together with urgency. There's not a great sense of time. It's just all kind of compacted together from one scene to the next. So you get this sense of, just like in Chronicles of Narnia with Aslan, the Lion King, that's bounding in and bounding out and bounding on. Jesus is very quick and very urgently going about his Father's business. Yeah. I thought that was an interesting view of Jesus here that goes with the sense of writing and style that you've already picked up and covered for us.
That's good. It does. It moves quickly from scene to scene. Compressing time. Eusebius said that Mark actually wasn't worried about chronology. He was just moving very quickly through the story. So what else? Anything from the baptism or the temptation or any of these scenes in here?
Absolutely. I'll go jump in on the baptism just really quickly. When I read it this week, this is not like me at all, but I actually got emotional reading it. And it's only 3 sentences, maybe 3? Yeah, 3 sentences.
Very quick, very short.
Very quick. And I got emotional reading it. And I think it just finally hit me really hard this week, that this is such an incredible moment. I almost put myself in John's shoes, where here you have a God who for hundreds and thousands of years, he's been proclaiming the Messiah is coming, like the law and the prophets for hundreds and thousands of years. It's like it's been all coming to this moment, like to this moment of Jesus coming down and John going, oh my gosh, here he is. I've been talking about him. I've been saying there's one coming after me. It's like he's literally handing the baton off to Jesus after hundreds and thousands of years of this being awaiting for the Messiah. And there he is. And as he enters the water, I could just imagine, I just feel so emotional. I know it's so weird and I feel weird talking about it, but think about it. Don't just read it because it's so familiar or it's something that is so easy for us to glance over. This is an incredible moment of God's work for lots of people throughout all of Scripture leading up to this moment. And as Jesus walks down into the water, John is just floored, and I was floored this week reading it. So don't rush reading this.
Yeah, no, that's good. To go through it and place yourself there. It's really always great to kind of put yourself into the scene, imagine the smells and the view and the water and the everything that's going on. It's really, really cool to be able to do that.
And one of the things, as I imagined that, was the word tear open. This is the only one of the Gospels that mentions as he has baptized, the heavens tore open. It's very violent sounding. This is word that is very powerful. And which is funny, I love, Craig, I'm going to ask you for a second, but I actually thought of what would that sound like if I was there? What does that look like? And then I thought, oh my gosh, this is kind of like when Noah, the heavens tore open and the waters come, judgment. I was thinking of, every time I think of the earth being tore open, I was thinking of judgment. This is not that. He tore open, what came out? The Spirit, like a dove hovering over Jesus. And then Craig, in our pre-talk, you talked about another imagery of this tearing open. Go ahead.
Yeah, and actually it's from the tear apart here of the heavens is from the Greek word schizo, which we get our word schism from. So it's the sense of this word that we think of as we're being torn apart. But to your point, Jesus is tearing apart the barrier between heaven and earth and filling his presence with that gap. And then correlate that with the tearing of the veil in the temple around Jesus's crucifixion, and that veil of death is torn and ripped down. So we get these barriers finally that have been stood up. You brought up the cherubim and some of the barriers through the tabernacle and the processes and the priests that were set up through the Old Testament, and that we've been reading about in Exodus. But all those were torn torn down with Jesus, and we have direct access to God. So I love all this. This is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a sense too in the rending, the schism, as you said, schizo, the word that means to tear, to rend, to rip. You see this going through several places. There's a lot of imagery there. There is this sense as well with the ancient early Christian church that there was this rendering as Jesus, the incarnation, Jesus coming into the world. You think of childbirth as rending a woman's womb open so that the
Good.
baby can come out. And there's this idea of this veil that separated that world, the spiritual world, from the physical world, and Jesus, that ripped open, and Jesus is coming in. So that imagery is peppered throughout. Okay, so yeah, that's a great recap of the actual baptism scene. And then it moves in. There's two other things that I really love in this chapter that kind of happen. One is the temptation scene, which is very brief in Mark. You get a much fuller rendering in Matthew and in Luke, but Mark's the only one who mentions it at the very end, that the wild beasts were with him, the wild animals, and they tended to him. That's so interesting to me, right?
Yeah.
That here, part of creation, God is in it. It kind of almost this. It to me, it gives this sense of being back in the Garden of Eden, where the animals and Adam and Eve kind of lived together, and there was this they it's almost like, because you have in the garden, when the fall happens, this also the schism between man and creation. The earth no longer will produce willingly. Adam's gonna have to work hard to get anything out of this earth. Like the earth is working against him all of a sudden. The ground is. The enmity between the woman and the serpent, who would represent kind of this creaturely kind of world. Now there's this fighting against each other, where the serpent is biting her and she's stomping the serpent. And if you ask Priscilla, totally, she does not like snakes. Like she wants nothing to do with snakes, right? There's this almost enmity that goes between them. But here in the wilderness, you have almost the reversal of that with Jesus, where the wild beasts are tending to him and helping him. So that was pretty cool, that scene. And the other scene that's interesting to me too is the scene where Jesus has been healing all day, all evening, into the night. It's this long day of healing. And again, Mark is using this to establish his authority over sickness, over disease, over leprosy. He heals all these people, right? He heals his mother-in-law and all that. He's healing all these people. And then the next morning they're looking for him and they can't find him. He's nowhere to be found. He's gone off into the wilderness again to pray, and it's at a solitary place to pray. Early in the morning, he's been praying, right? And it's almost like he has to have that time so that he can come back, and it replenishes him, it recharges him, and he goes away to pray. As busy as he is, right? He makes this time to pray, and they finally find him and say, "Where have you been? The people are looking for you. All these crowds want you." He says, "No, let's go away from the crowds. Let's go away from the crowds to the small villages where I've come to preach." It's the first time that the word preach is used, kerusso. It's also really the first time Jesus kind of establishes the gospel, that he's come, the good news. It's the first time that's used, good news, gospel. He's come to preach the good news to the people. So those are two just really pretty interesting scenes to me. Did you guys get anything else out of the rest of this chapter?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because we've been in Exodus and now we have this reminder of Jesus in the baptism. I was reminded of something the first time I read it through, is you kind of have this image of Israel in the Exodus, and you have Jesus kind of being the new Exodus. And I'll explain. You have the Israelites, they journey to Egypt to escape an oppressive king, right? And then you have Jesus, who his family escapes to Egypt to escape from an oppressive king, which was Herod. So you have those matching. And then you have God calling his people, Israelites, his son, and he calls them back out of Egypt, which we just saw with them coming up out of Egypt. And then you have God calling his son, Jesus, out of Egypt after Herod died, and then to come out of Egypt. And then you have the Israelites passing through the wilderness for 40 years, and then you have Jesus in the wilderness with the enemy for 40 for 40 days and 40
Days.
nights, right? There's the 40. And then you have the Israelites, they're about to pass through the Jordan to get into the promised land. And you just had Jesus pass through the Jordan to be baptized. And so you have these images right here. And so as you were reading and reminding me of this, I was like, oh yeah, there's all those connections I've made. And I may have missed a few, but those are the ones
No, the ones that they're absolutely right. It's out of Luke and out of Matthew, not so much out of Mark, but you have all that. And of course, the baptism here is described. Definitely the parting of the waters, the rending of the skies, as we've already talked about.
Yep.
It's all this rich imagery from the Old Testament, no doubt about it. Even John the Baptist, the way it describes him, and he is that Elijah, right, figure of the Old Testament, bringing together this bridge between the Old Testament prophet, the way he's dressed, the way he acts, the way he preaches, the Old Testament to the New. Really powerful there. Yeah.
Theologically, we see Jesus is taking on the vocation of Israel, and he succeeds where Israel failed. And because of that, he is not only the new Adam, but he's a new Israel and all of our salvation. He's accomplishing what God had tasked Israel, the people, to do.
Absolutely.
Kind of fell down through their idolatry, as we just saw in Exodus and subsequent behavior throughout the years.
Absolutely. Yeah, guys, that's excellent. So Mark chapter 1 is setting the story up right from the beginning with who Jesus is, the power that he has. You see it. You don't even get through the end of the first chapter and you see his power. You see his authority, unquestionably, the witnesses, impeccable witnesses, John the Baptist, God himself, even the demons, admitting who he is. So Mark really wants to set it up very quickly for you for the rest of the story. And it's going to be a great story. Guys, I hope that y'all will follow along with us in the Well Bible Reading Podcast. Each week, we're going to be going through, we're going to be finishing up Exodus here soon. We're going to be going through the entire Gospel of Mark, and it's going to be a really fruitful time. Hey, Craig and Amber, thanks for joining me today. God bless you guys. Thanks for all your study that you do. And those of you out there, I pray that you just keep going, keep at it with us, and God is going to bless you. So God bless you until we see you again.
Bye.